Hi, this is Professor Guyad with Middlesex College with another lecture. Today we're going to be talking about exceptions and exception handling. So exceptions in Java is just a fancy name for an error. So the exception class is a predefined class in Java that is used whenever a compilation error happens, a runtime error happens. Exceptions are not caught before the main method is run. They're caught after the method is run. So these exceptions halt execution of the program, and that is not good, right? So we want to have exception handling to catch these exceptions that are thrown in order to keep the flow of execution running. So let me go ahead and share my screen as usual. So here we are in Visual Studio Code, and I've created a class called exceptions, and it has a main method, and we're going to look at some common exceptions in Java that are pre-built, and we're going to look at the try catch finally block, and we're going to define our own exception and catch it. So this is the exceptions class I created. Here is a custom exception that I created. So it's called my exception, and it extends the exception class. So going along with that concept of inheritance, right? So my exception is inheriting all of the properties and methods and attributes of the exception class, which is, again, pre-built by Java engineers. So, and then the constructor for the my exception class just takes a message string and displays that message. So returns it. So we go back over to exceptions, and let's try throwing, literally, right? We're trying a block of code. And in that block of code, we're simply throwing the exception. So typically, if we didn't have this try catch block, we threw an exception, the exception would halt the execution of the code and just leave us with the message. But because we have a try catch finally, we really just a try catch, we can try this bit of code and catch the exception as it occurs during runtime. So in my try block, I'm throwing the exception, and the exception message is custom. It's you threw an exception, and then I'm catching the generic exception E. I could change this to my exception because that's the one being thrown. So I know that if I wanted to make it more specific to a more particular exception, I know that the my exception that I created is the one that's being thrown, so that's the one that I want to catch. And when it's caught, I want to print the message, which is right here. It says right here, the message is you threw an exception. And then the finally block is just used. It will, the code in the finally block will always run regardless of whether there's an exception caught or not. If there's no exception caught, the finally block will run, and if the exception is caught, the finally block will run. Either way. So we have that. So what we would expect, excuse me, is that this exception is thrown and it's caught, and the message is going to be printed. So we should see you threw an exception in the output down here. And we should also see I will always print. So because the exception was caught, the flow of execution of the main method will continue to this line 16 down here. And this is our first pre-built Java exception that we're going to look at, the arithmetic exception. So when I click run for the first time in this video, we should see you threw an exception, I will always print, and then we should see the arithmetic exception. So let's see that happen when I run this. Yes, you threw an exception. I will always print, and then an exception was thrown that halted the execution of the rest of this code, right? The rest of this code did not run. So the arithmetic exception, divide by zero, right? You can't divide by zero, right? In terms of mathematical principles, right? That is illegal. So in Java, it is also illegal. So an arithmetic exception was thrown. Great. That's our first exception that we're going to take a look at. If I comment this out, we'll take a look at our next exception. Here I have a string called my name, and the value being stored in my name is a string called Mary. And I am trying to access my name.charat. I'm trying to access the 8th index, the character at index 8, which does that exist? Well, the M is at index 0, A is at 1, R is at 2, Y is at 3. No, right? There's no index 8 in my name. So we should see this string index out of bounds exception. Let's see that happen. So I can actually comment this out too, because we've already seen how to do exception handling with the try catch finally. So I'm going to comment this out, and all we should see is the string index out of bounds exception. So when I run this, we scroll up here, and that's exactly what we do see. The string index out of bounds. Index 8 out of bounds for length 4, right? Because Mary only has length of 4. And we tried to access the 8th index. Okay, sounds good. And then our next exception is very similar to the prior exception. We have the array index out of bounds exception. So I declared an integer array of numbers. It only has a length of 3. So when I, again, try to access the 8th index, we're going to get a similar out of bounds exception, except this time for arrays. So when I run this, indeed, I get the array out of bounds exception. And what's so nice about the Java exceptions is that they tell you exactly what the reason for it, right? So this index 8 out of bounds for length 3 is the message for the array index out of bounds exception. Just like for my exception, I defined up here, you threw an exception to be the message. This is the message for this type of exception. And it tells you exactly where it happened in the exceptions.java file at line 24. And is that correct? Yes, this is exactly where it happened. Okay, now we haven't covered in input output yet, IO for short, input output IO, but I'm going to show you another type of exception, two, in fact, the file not found exception and the IO exception. So here we have a pre-built Java class called file input stream. And for the file input stream, when you're declaring it, when you're instantiating that class, when you're creating this input object here, you have to give it a file extension, like a file, a directory to locate the file. This, of course, I don't have a directory at this location that points to this location, blah, right? The C drive and then blah, blah, that doesn't exist. So that's where the file not found exception will come in. And then the IO exception comes in when you try to when you try to read or write from a file that doesn't exist or some other input-output reason that causes the IO exception. So in this case, because input doesn't exist, this file, right, doesn't exist, input.read surely won't work because this file doesn't exist. So we're trying to read, which is a input activity, input method, and as opposed to an output method. So .read is an input method. And of course, because the file doesn't exist, this .read is not going to work. So we're going to also get the IO exception. So let's go ahead and run this so we can see those two exceptions in action. And that's exactly what we see. We see the file not unhandled exception type. So unhandled means that there was no try catch used to handle, right? This is all exception handling to handle the exception when it was happening during runtime. And the file not found exception is the exception that happened first. And then when we tried to, which was occurring here, and then it tried to also read from that file here on line 30, and this IO exception occurred. So it was not able to do that. So again, what we did in this lecture was learn exception handling using the try, catch, finally. Really, the exception handling occurs with the try, catch. You know, you try a bit of code, and if an exception occurs in the try block, you can catch it in the catch block. And if you want to catch any exception, right, which is the safer way to go, you can just use exception, and the name of the exception is E, or you can call it error or whatever you want, ERR, whatever you want. I shortened it to E. If you want to catch a particular exception, you shorten it to a particular type of exception, like my exception, or, you know, IO exception, right? So there's the general and the particular. So the exception was caught, and then the finally block will always run regardless of an exception is thrown or not. Exception is caught or not. And then we went over some common exceptions in Java: the arithmetic exception, the string index out of bounds exception, the array index out of bounds exception, and the file not found exception, and the IO exception. We also created our own custom exception. I named it my exception, and it extends the exception class, so it inherits everything from the exception, pre-built exception class, and we use this as a constructor to inherit the message from the message signature from the exception class. Thank you for following along with this lecture on exception handling and exceptions in general, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture. Bye.